It was supposed to be one of the happiest days of his life. A day where all the sacrifices, late-night deployments, and missed family birthdays came together in one proud moment. Sergeant Major Aaron Watson, a Black Marine, had made the long journey from his base to witness his son's graduation from the prestigious military academy. His son, Elijah, was about to become an Army officer, a moment that would mark the beginning of a promising military career. But as Watson entered the Grand Hall, dressed in his full Marine uniform, pristine and polished with a chest full of medals representing years of service, the day suddenly took an unexpected turn. His heart swelled with pride as he scanned the crowd. He was about to watch his son cross the stage. This was a milestone not just for Elijah, but for their entire family. However, before Watson could even take a seat, 2 security guards approached him, their stern expressions making it clear that something was wrong. One of the guards, a tall, broad-shouldered man, glanced at Watson's uniform and then coldly said, "You need to leave the premises. You don't belong here." Watson's stomach dropped. He was stunned. The confusion on his face was evident, but the guards weren't budging. "I'm here for my son's graduation," Watson said, his voice calm but now tinged with uncertainty. "I'm Sergeant Major Aaron Watson, U.S. Marine Corps." The guards weren't impressed. "We don't have you listed on the clearance." "List," one guard replied. "Without clearance, you cannot stay. You need to leave." Watson was taken aback. He had dedicated his life to this country, putting his life on the line for its freedoms and values. And now, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, he was being told he couldn't even attend his own son's graduation. He could feel the sting of embarrassment starting to rise. His chest tightened, and a wave of frustration washed over him. How could this happen? He looked around at the sea of attendees, family, friends, and colleagues all there to witness the milestone. The security guards had no idea who they were speaking to. This wasn't just any person. They were talking to a Marine, a veteran with decades of service to his country. "Sir, I don't think you understand," Watson said, trying to keep his composure. "I've been in the military for over 20 years. My son is graduating today. I'm here as his father, not some random guest. This is a moment of pride for me and my family. Please, I just want to watch my son walk across that stage." The guards weren't moved by his words. One of them reached for a walkie-talkie, and within moments another officer appeared, an official from the academy. He too seemed confused by the situation but echoed the same sentiment. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave. You don't have clearance. We can't make exceptions." Every word felt like a slap to the face. Watson's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't some outsider. He was a father, a Marine, and a man who had served this nation with honor. To be treated like this on his son's most important day felt like a betrayal, a failure to recognize the sacrifice of so many like him. The other attendees, many of whom had been watching the interaction, whispered among themselves. But no, one stepped in. Watson's heart sank further. He could feel the eyes on him, the judgment. This wasn't just about him being denied access. It was about something much deeper. Why was this happening? Was it because of his skin color? Was it because he was a black man in a uniform that some couldn't respect? The thought crept into his mind, but he pushed it away. There was no room for that kind of thinking. Not today. Just as the tension in the room began to escalate, something incredible happened. 6 Navy SEALs, all in their full tactical gear, walked into the scene. Their presence was undeniable, and the room seemed to freeze as everyone turned to see them. The guards, who had been so confident moments ago, seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to react to the arrival of these highly decorated soldiers. The SEALs' eyes scanned the room, and they quickly assessed the situation. They'd been watching from the sidelines, observing how Watson was being treated. It wasn't right, and they weren't about to let it slide. One of the SEALs, a tall man with a calm but intense demeanor, stepped forward and said, "This man stays. If you have an issue with that, you'll have to deal with us." There was an almost palpable shift in the atmosphere. The guards faltered, unable to meet the SEAL's unwavering gaze. One of the SEALs placed his hand on Watson's shoulder and looked directly at the guards. "He's a Marine. He's earned the right to be here just like anyone else in this room. You'll respect that." For a moment, it felt like time stood still. The room was silent, except for the quiet hum of tension in the air. The guards, recognizing the authority of the SEALs, stepped back without saying another word. They didn't argue, didn't try to push further. They knew their place, and it wasn't worth challenging the reputation and respect that the SEALs carried. Watson, still in disbelief, felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. These men, these warriors, had just come to his defense. Not because they owed him anything, but because they understood what was right. The presence of the SEALs wasn't just about power or intimidation. It was a reminder of what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself. It wasn't about individual achievement, it was about loyalty, honor, and brotherhood. These SEALs didn't hesitate to stand up for Watson because, in their eyes, he wasn't just a Marine. He was a fellow soldier, a brother in arms, deserving of respect. With the situation now under control, Watson finally sat down in the audience. He had no more words to say to the security guards or the academy official. The SEALs had handled it all. As he took his seat, he glanced around the room and saw a new respect in the eyes of the other attendees. The moment had shifted from confrontation to unity. In a strange way, the day was now about more than just his son's graduation. It was about something much bigger, the strength of solidarity and the undeniable power of standing up for what's right. When Elijah Watson finally walked across the stage to receive his diploma, Watson's chest swelled with pride. His son had worked hard, sacrificed countless hours, and endured the same hardships that he had faced years before. But today, this was Elijah's moment to shine. As father and son locked eyes, there was no need for words. They shared a bond that transcended anything they could say. In that moment, the struggles Watson had endured and the sacrifices he had made felt worth it. He wasn't just there for his son's graduation. He was there to witness the legacy of service they shared. The fight for respect, the fight for brotherhood, and the fight for what was right had been passed on. As Watson looked at the SEALs one more time, he smiled, silently thanking them. They had stood for him, and they had reminded him of something vital. No matter what, the military was still a family, and today that family stood strong. Together. Watson, taken aback but not willing to back down, tried to reason with the guards. He explained who he was and the reason for his visit, but they weren't hearing it. "You need to leave," one guard repeated, his tone sharp and unyielding. As the words were spoken again, the frustration in Watson's chest began to swell. They were not giving him a chance to explain, nor were they showing any recognition of his service. "I've served my country for over 2 decades. I'm here to see my son graduate," Watson said, his voice steady, but with a trace of urgency. His pride in his son in that very moment was palpable, but the guards, unmoved, became even more aggressive, as though they were not even listening to him. They were issuing commands, dismissing his words, and showing no respect for the man standing in front of them. The second guard, now standing, inches from him, folded his arms and looked Watson up and down as if evaluating him like some kind of trespasser. "Sir, you're not on the list. We've been told no exceptions. Please leave," the guard insisted. Watson's patience, once ironclad, was beginning to fray. His mind raced. This wasn't just a random event. This was his son's graduation. This wasn't just another day. It was a life-altering milestone for Elijah, his son, the culmination of years of sacrifice, education, and hard work. A day that would be etched in both of their memories forever. And yet, here he was, being treated like an outsider, like he didn't belong. His heart sank as the thought started to creep in. Is this because of my uniform? Because I'm a black man in this military? He quickly shook off the thought, but it lingered. There was something inexplicably wrong here, something deeper than a simple mix-up over military clearance. This felt personal. As Watson continued to stand his ground, refusing to move, the tension in the air thickened. The noise around him seemed to fade. His focus narrowed. The guards were not backing down. His voice, which had started off calm, now carried a firmness that belied his growing anger. He looked around, hoping to see some sign of support from the other attendees, but it seemed like the room had turned against him. People looked away, pretending not to notice, some even shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was as though he had become invisible, a shadow in the room. Nobody spoke up. Nobody challenged the guards. The emptiness of the situation hit him hard. His military service, his dedication, his time away from home, his long deployments, and the family sacrifices, all those things seemed to evaporate in the face of these security guards' refusal to listen. Watson had served in some of the world's most dangerous places, had faced down threats from the enemy, but today, here, was this racism? He asked himself again. It was hard to ignore the feeling that perhaps in the minds of the guards and the officer, his military uniform didn't matter. Only the color of his skin did. Could it be? Watson's mind grappled with the reality of what was happening in front of him, but he quickly forced the thoughts back. This wasn't the time for that kind of speculation. But even so, he couldn't help but wonder. The frustration continued to bubble inside him as the officer and guards continued to press. It was as if Watson had become a symbol of something they didn't want to deal with. His presence was an inconvenience, and yet all he wanted was to see his son's face light up when he received his diploma. That's it. But now, with every word, with every refusal, it felt like they were taking away his right to be proud, to witness this moment. "I'm not going anywhere," Watson finally said, his voice low but full of resolve. He was done with being polite. He wasn't about to let these men take this moment from him. This day was his son's and no one would ruin it. But as the situation reached a boiling point, something unexpected happened. Before the officer or the guards could escalate further, a new presence entered the scene. 6 Navy SEALs, all in their rare tactical uniforms, walked into the hallway, silently assessing the situation. The room, already tense, grew even more still as everyone turned to look at the newcomers. It was clear from the moment they entered that these men weren't ordinary soldiers. Their presence was commanding. The officer faltered, and even the guards seemed to hesitate. The SEALs stood shoulder to shoulder, exuding an air of authority that could not be ignored. One of the SEALs, a man with a stone-cold gaze, stepped forward. "He stays," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. The energy in the room shifted. The SEALs had arrived, and their words carried weight. The officer and the guards knew better than to challenge them. The SEALs didn't speak again. They didn't need to. They stood as a wall, a symbol of what it meant to have your back, no matter the cost. Watson's heart lifted. In that moment, he knew he wasn't alone. And then, just when the situation seemed about to spiral out of control, something incredible happened. The doors at the back of the room opened, and 6 Navy SEALs, dressed in their full tactical gear, walked into the room with a quiet but undeniable presence. The guards, who had been so confident just moments ago, suddenly went silent. Their posture stiffened, and for the first time they seemed unsure of themselves. These weren't just any soldiers. They were Navy SEALs, the most elite warriors in the U.S. military, with a reputation that preceded them. The kind of reputation that made people rethink their decisions. Watson, who had been standing there, growing more frustrated and disheartened with each passing second, looked up in surprise. His eyes widened as he saw the SEALs, their expressions calm but intense, the kind of calm that only comes from years of experience in the most harrowing situations. They moved into the space between the guards and Watson like a unified force, silent, powerful, and resolute. They weren't here to be subtle. Their presence spoke volumes. The SEALs had been sitting in the audience, quietly observing the entire scene unfold. They'd been watching the way Watson, an honored Marine veteran, was being treated, how the guards and even the officer had disregarded his rights, disregarded his service. To the SEALs, this wasn't just an isolated misunderstanding. It was a direct affront to everything they stood for. The SEALs were well versed in fighting battles, some of the most dangerous and high-stakes missions anyone could imagine. But this was different. This was about respect. It was about standing up for a fellow soldier, a man who had earned his place. As they watched the humiliation Watson was facing, they knew they had to act. Without a word, they approached the security, guards and the officer, their movements deliberate and measured. There was no hesitation in their steps, no uncertainty in their resolve. They stood tall, their presence overwhelming, sending a clear message that this situation was no longer just about Watson or the guards. This was about principle, duty, and integrity. Watson, still standing in disbelief, watched as the SEALs took charge of the situation. He could feel a shift in the air, a palpable change in the atmosphere. The tension that had been rising like a storm cloud seemed to dissipate in the presence of these men. One of the SEALs, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a man who had faced life or death situations before, addressed the guards. "He stays," he said firmly, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. His gaze locked onto the officer who stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye in the space was now on the SEALs, who stood there like an immovable wall. The guards, who had been so adamant in their refusal just moments before, now looked uncertain. They were not used to being challenged, especially not by men of this caliber. And it was clear that they didn't know how to handle the situation now that the SEALs had intervened. Without a moment of hesitation, the same SEAL spoke again, his voice unwavering. "And if you have a problem with that, you'll have to go, through us." The SEAL's words reverberated through the room. The power in their statement wasn't just in the words themselves, but in the sheer presence of these men. The room, which had been filled with whispers and uncertainty, now felt like a different space entirely. It was no longer a place of tension and conflict. It was a place of solidarity, of unspoken understanding. Watson's heart swelled with something that he hadn't expected to feel in this moment: relief. For the first time since the confrontation had begun, he felt that someone truly understood. That someone, in this vast sea of faces, had his back. These men, these elite soldiers, were standing up for him, not because they owed him anything, but because they knew what was right. The officer, still stunned by the sudden shift in power, looked at the SEALs and then back at Watson. He glanced at the guards, who were clearly unsure of how to proceed. The balance of power had shifted, and it was no longer in their favor. The officer swallowed hard and stepped back, the realization hitting him like a thunderclap. He wasn't the one in charge here anymore. The SEALs were. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The room fell into an almost eerie silence. It wasn't the kind of silence born of fear, but rather one of quiet respect. Respect for the SEALs and for the cause they were defending. The entire audience had witnessed something extraordinary. The arrival of the SEALs wasn't just an intervention. It was a statement that no one, no matter their rank, should ever be treated with such disrespect. The 6 SEALs didn't say another word. They didn't need to. Their actions spoke louder than anything they could have said. They didn't move forward to escalate the situation. They didn't shout or threaten. They stood silently, their posture speaking volumes. The tension that had been suffocating Watson began to melt away, replaced by a sense of support and strength. The guards, now completely out of their depth, finally began to retreat. The officer, realizing that he had no ground to stand on, nodded and stepped aside. The confrontation was over. But it wasn't just over in the physical sense. It was over in the emotional and symbolic sense as well. The SEALs had taken a stand for Watson, for justice, and for what was right. They had reminded everyone in that room of the values that the military stood for: respect, honor, and solidarity. Watson, who had been so close to losing his composure, felt a sense of quiet triumph wash over him. He could breathe again. He had fought for this moment, and in the end, it wasn't just his fight. It was their fight. The SEALs had given him the support he needed, and in doing so, they had turned a humiliating situation into something far more powerful, a testament to the strength of military brotherhood. As the ceremony continued, Watson finally found his seat in the audience. His body, which had been tense and coiled with frustration, slowly began to relax. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on his son, Elijah, who was now standing proudly on the stage, ready to receive his diploma. The moment was everything Watson had hoped for and more. As Elijah's name was called and he walked forward to accept his diploma, Watson's chest swelled with pride. He was no longer a man standing in the shadows of disrespect. He was a father standing tall and proud, watching his son take his place in the world. And as Elijah glanced over at his father in the crowd, their eyes met for a brief moment. No, words were needed. They shared an unspoken understanding. They both knew what had just transpired. And in that shared look, Watson saw not only his son's future, but also the legacy of service and honor that had been passed down through generations. This was not just a graduation. It was a reminder that the bonds forged in battle, in sacrifice, and in respect were unbreakable. And today those bonds had silenced the room and restored a father's pride. The presence of the SEALs wasn't just about power or intimidation. It was a reminder of what it meant to be part of something larger than oneself. It wasn't about individual achievement. It was about loyalty, honor, and brotherhood. These SEALs didn't hesitate to stand up for Watson because, in their eyes, he wasn't just a Marine, he was a fellow soldier, a brother in arms deserving of respect. For Watson, standing there as the SEALs effortlessly took control of the situation, something profound shifted inside him. The respect he had always carried for his fellow servicemen, what it means to stand up for one another, to defend what is right, and to protect the honor of those who serve. Watson's eyes fell back on his son, Elijah, who was still standing at the podium, preparing to receive his diploma. Elijah, who had worked tirelessly for this moment, whose hard work and dedication had paid off in spades, was about to take the stage. For a brief second, Watson felt a pang of guilt. Had he let this situation distract him from the joy of this moment? Had it almost stolen this day from Elijah? But then, as if on cue, Elijah's gaze shifted to the crowd, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. There was no need for words, no nods, no waves, just a silent exchange that spoke volumes. Elijah knew what had happened, and though Watson's heart swelled with pride for his son, he realized it wasn't just about this ceremony. It was about the kind of man Elijah had become. It was about Elijah's own integrity, his courage, and the lessons that Watson had worked so hard to instill in him. For Watson, the moment was bittersweet. The day was no longer just about his son's graduation. It had become something far bigger. The ceremony, which should have been a straightforward celebration of achievement, had turned into a reminder of everything that mattered most. The SEALs had reminded him of the unbreakable bonds of military service, of the brotherhood that transcends all divisions. And in that moment, as Elijah stepped up to receive his diploma, Watson reflected on the years of service, the sacrifices, and the relationships built on trust and mutual respect. He thought about the countless soldiers he had served with, men and women who had made sacrifices of their own to protect the values that the military stood for. This moment was not just about pride for his son. It was about the pride of a father who had served a country that had tested him time and time again, but had never broken him. It was also about the unspoken lessons Watson had imparted to Elijah over the years. As his son looked back and caught his father's eye, Watson saw in him not just a reflection of his own values, but a young man who had learned what it meant to stand up for what is right, to defend those who need it, and to walk through the world with his head held high. Elijah wasn't just following in Watson's footsteps, he was forging his own path, one that would be guided by honor, loyalty, and perhaps most importantly, courage. The power of the SEALs' intervention didn't just end with their actions. It reverberated throughout the room, transforming a private moment of humiliation into a public display of solidarity. It was a reminder that the military, for all its discipline and structure, is rooted in a deep sense of community. A community that doesn't just stand together in times of battle, it stands together in times of injustice. Watson's heart swelled with gratitude as the ceremony continued. While the SEALs had given him the courage to stand tall in the face of adversity, it was the shared understanding in the room that gave him something even more profound, a sense of belonging. The respect he had always carried for his fellow service members, now cemented by the actions of the SEALs, reminded him that the bonds forged in the heat of battle are stronger than any rules or regulations. As the ceremony wrapped up, and Elijah proudly stood as an officer, ready to step into the next chapter of his life, Watson couldn't help but smile. His pride in his son was limitless, but more than that, he felt a deep sense of pride in the world they both inhabited, a world where loyalty, respect, and honor still meant something. As the applause erupted around him, Watson leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a moment of peace. He looked at Elijah, now smiling and accepting congratulations from classmates, friends, and family. The anger, the frustration, the pain from earlier in the day felt like distant memories. What remained was the unshakable pride of a father who had witnessed his son's achievement. But more than that, Watson knew that the lessons of that day would stay with Elijah for the rest of his life. Today, Elijah had not just earned a degree. He had witnessed firsthand the power of standing up for what's right. And as Watson sat there, watching his son embrace the future, he realized that it wasn't just about passing down a legacy of military service. It was about passing down a legacy of strength, honor, and resilience, the same values that had been passed down to him. And as the day wound to a close, Watson knew that he had given Elijah something more than a proud moment to remember. He had given him the most important lesson of all, that true honor is found in the courage to stand together, no matter the odds. Finally, the ceremony began. Watson was able to sit in the audience, his hands resting on his knees, still processing everything that had just unfolded. His mind was buzzing, but his focus slowly shifted back to the reason he was there. His son, Elijah, was about to walk across the stage, receiving his diploma as a newly minted Army officer. The entire room seemed to swell with pride as the graduates marched, their faces beaming with the same sense of accomplishment that Watson had once felt on his own graduation day. But for Watson, the pride he felt in this moment was different. It wasn't just the pride of a father watching his son succeed. It was deeper, more profound. His chest swelled not only with the knowledge of how far his son had come, but also with something more powerful: gratitude. He watched Elijah stand tall, his uniform crisp and neat, his face a perfect blend of determination and humility. It was a reflection of everything Watson had hoped for as a father, the embodiment of all the values he had tried to instill in him over the years. But in this moment, there was something else Watson couldn't shake, a deep sense of appreciation for the events that had transpired earlier. Something about today's confrontation had reinforced an important lesson he had always known, but one that had been tested in such a raw and real way. It wasn't just the fact that his son had made it to this moment. As he watched Elijah step up to receive his diploma, Watson realized something more significant: the power of the brotherhood that had just come to his aid. It wasn't just the SEALs nor the men and women they served with. It was the very essence of what military service meant: standing together, no matter the odds, no matter the injustice, no matter the adversity. In a way, today had been a living testament to everything that military service stood for. The SEALs hadn't simply intervened out of duty. They had done it because they understood the deep and unshakable bonds of brotherhood that transcend rank, race, and all the petty divisions that can sometimes tear at the fabric of society. For Watson, it wasn't just about his son being able to walk across the stage. It was about witnessing his son learn the true power of that bond. Elijah had seen firsthand the way a soldier could be supported, uplifted, and defended by others. He had watched as men who were once strangers had stood up and protected his father in the face of blatant disrespect. Those SEALs, without hesitation, had treated Watson as a brother, and that was the kind of lesson no classroom could teach, The ceremony continued. Watson couldn't help but think back to all the hard times, the moments where he had felt defeated, misunderstood, or invisible. He had faced battles in the field, but those had always been clear-cut, an enemy to fight, a mission to complete. The battles he had faced in society, though, had often been more insidious, like the one that had occurred earlier in the day. They were harder to fight because they came from the very systems that were supposed to protect him. Yet in the face of all that, there was always something greater than any single man's struggle: the collective power of people who believed in doing what was right. What happened that day wasn't just a fight against an injustice, it was a living demonstration that people still cared. There were still people willing to stand up, to protect, to defend what was right. The message was clear: you are not alone. For Watson, the realization was humbling. The anger he had felt earlier, the frustration, the helplessness, those emotions were now replaced with something far more profound. Gratitude, yes, but also an overwhelming sense of peace. He had spent years fighting battles, some physical, some mental, and some emotional. But now, as he watched his son take his place as an officer, he realized that he had fought those battles not just for himself, but for the next generation, for Elijah. Elijah had always been aware of the struggles his father had faced. Watson had never hidden the challenges, the disappointments, and the setbacks. But he had always kept moving forward. He had never allowed those challenges to break him. And now, watching Elijah about to embark on his own journey as an officer, Watson knew his son had absorbed all of those lessons. It was no longer just about surviving. It was about carrying on with dignity and purpose, and always remembering what matters most: standing up for others. As Watson sat in that audience, he thought about how far he'd come, how far Elijah had come, and how far they could still go. They were part of a long legacy, one built on sacrifice, resilience, and a commitment to honor. It wasn't just about serving in the military, it was about being part of something that was greater than oneself. When the applause erupted, it wasn't just for the graduates. It was for the families, the teachers, the mentors, and even the strangers who had come together to support these young men and women as they took their next steps. For Watson, it was a reminder that no one truly accomplishes anything alone. Success wasn't just about individual achievements, it was about the people who